Dear colleagues, in 2010 the United States, which is the only democratic country in the world to have adopted citizen-based taxation, enacted the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, the so-called FATCA, which is an extraterritorial legislation aimed at preventing tax evasion by US citizens and residents through offshore accounts. As part of the global efforts to fight corruption, cross-border tax fraud and tax evasion, European member states have concluded bilateral intergovernmental agreements with the United States in order to implement FATCA, obliging European financial institutions to report to the US tax authorities all holdings of their so-called US persons customers. I would like to underline that the Petitions Committee and the European Parliament strongly support tax transparency and all the efforts made to fight tax fraud. However, more than 8 years after FATCA's adoption, while unilateralism and protectionism unfortunately appear to be the cornerstones of the US foreign policy, it is now high time to assess the extraterritorial effects of FATCA on thousands and thousands of law-abiding EU citizens and their families. Therefore, in 2016, a collective of European citizens from 9 different member states submitted a petition to the European Parliament, to my committee, alerting us via the committee about the impact of FATCA and its implementing intergovernmental agreement on European citizens. They witnessed about violation of various fundamental principles of EU law, including the right to respect for private life, the prohibition of discrimination and data protection rules, as well as the EU Payment Accounts Directive. All this was brought to our attention, and to tell you the truth, it was shocking. In practice, FATCA has affected a large number of citizens in Europe, such as citizens who are nationals of both the US and a member state, and in particular the so-called accidental Americans, who, by accident of birth, inherited US citizenship, but who maintain no ties at all to the United States, having never lived, worked or studied in the US, and they do not hold US social security numbers. They are in many cases completely unaware of them being citizens in the US. FATCA does require foreign financial institutions to search for US persons by looking at a variety of indicators and indicators of power of attorney over the account to a US person with a US address, against which the individual is required to prove that he or she is not a US person. Because non-compliance with the requirement imposed results in heavy fines for financial institutions, many of them in the EU responded by avoiding all commercial business with customers presenting any US connection, whether actual or not. This appears to be in breach with the Payment Accounts Directive and the right for all EU citizens to have access to a payment account with basic features without discrimination. In addition, financial institutions have to disclose detailed information on accounts held by presumed so-called US persons to the US Internal Revenue Service via their national governments. And this, and I'm eager to convey this message to the Commission this evening, this could constitute a breach of EU data protection rules and EU fundamental rights, and therefore it requires further investigation. The lives and livelihood of thousands of citizens in the EU are at stake here. Those falling within the definition of EU persons have their savings account frozen. They have no access to banking services, including life insurance, pensions and mortgages, due to the reluctance of financial institutions to follow the FATCA reporting. Their family members are also affected. And these issues need to be addressed at EU level altogether. And it is now, Madam Commissioner, high time that the European Commission takes appropriate action to protect the rights of affected European citizens, in particular the so-called accidental Americans. And I wonder how the European Commission and the Council intend to include the situation of accidental Americans in your transposition assessment of the Payment Accounts Directive. More generally, a full impact assessment of FATCA on EU citizens is badly needed at this moment to determine whether a serious discrepancy between EU citizens and residents in different member states exists concerning data protection. And last but not least, and I'm coming to an end, a common EU approach, and in particular an EU-US agreement on FATCA, could in fact prove to be more effective in ensuring reciprocity and upholding fundamental principles of EU law. I look very much forward to hearing from the Commission and equally from the Council on the diplomatic and legislative steps that you consider in order to protect the rights and interests of concerned EU citizens against the effects of FATCA. And I thank you very much.
I'm very sorry because it was 5 minutes and now it was over 6. So anyway, I will now like to invite Caroline Edstadler on behalf of the Council to take the floor.
Thank you, President. Honourable members, Madam Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. As the honourable member is aware, the Payment Accounts Directive is an important piece of legislation that improves access by citizens to basic banking services. A number of measures to ensure access to a basic payment account were suggested by the Commission in its recommendation of July 2011, and these measures were supported by the European Parliament in its resolution of 4 July 2012. In July 2014, the Parliament and the Council enacted the Payment Account Directive, which has been in application since September 2016, and all Member States have notified transposition of the measures contained in the directive. However, it is for the Commission to assess the implementation of EU legislation by the Member States and in particular the correct transposition of the Payment Accounts Directive. We trust that the Commission will carefully assess whether it has been correctly implemented by all Member States and will take any appropriate measures in case of any breach. Honourable members, when it comes to the US legislation on FATCA, its possible extraterritorial effects, let me state the following. It is a principle of international law that the sovereignty of each state implies that it can freely define its taxpayers. Therefore, it is not for the Council to interpret the legal provisions concerning taxpayers in specific non-EU countries. The double taxation situation that can arise from that principle are solved through bilateral agreements based on international arrangements like the OECD ones. It is not the role of the Council either to interpret intergovernmental agreements concluded by Member States and the US or to evaluate the impact that they may have on citizens. In the light of these considerations, the possibility for the negotiation an EU-US agreement on FATCA has not been discussed by the Council. Finally, on the General Data Protection Regulation, as the honourable member is aware, is entered into application on 25 May. The GDPR provides that processing of personal data, such as the disclosure of personal data on bank accounts, is only lawful if its processing has a legal basis, such as an international agreement between an EU member state and the US. Moreover, the GDPR applies to the processing of personal data regardless whether the processing of the data takes place within the Union or not. Therefore, the same data protection rules apply to all data subjects who are in the Union, including EU citizens and residents, irrespective in which member state they are staying. Furthermore, the GDPR sets out harmonised rules for transfers and disclosures of personal data from the EU to non-EU countries. Thank you for your attention.
Paljon kiitos.
Thank you very much. Carolina Edstadler for the Council. And now for the Commission, Commissioner Jourova.
Madam President, honourable members, first of all, I would like to recall that the US Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, FATCA, is implemented through intergovernmental agreements negotiated bilaterally between the US and each member state. Member states chose not to give the Commission a mandate to negotiate an EU agreement, preferring bilateral agreements. I would also like to underline that the information exchange requirements under the Act as such are similar to those in our EU Directive on mandatory automatic exchange of information in the field of taxation and to the OECD global standard for the automatic exchange of financial account information, which is currently being implemented by over 100 jurisdictions. At the same time, the Commission acknowledges that FATCA and the related intergovernmental agreements may have the unintended effect of hindering access to financial services in the EU for persons regarded by the US authorities as American citizens or tax residents. This includes accidental Americans, people who were born in the United States or to United States parents and who may not have any other connection to the United States. As the European Parliament rightly states in the oral question, US tax rules are based on citizenship. As a result, anyone holding US citizenship, anyone residing mostly in the United States or entitled to permanent residence in the United States will be subject to US tax obligations. This has been acknowledged at international level and in the tax treaties signed by the US with all member states. The Commission understands that one of the practical problems that EU financial institutions are confronted with is that they need a US tax identification or social security number to report the financial information required under FATCA to the United States tax authorities. However, customers who are subject to FATCA may not have such a number, and obtaining it seems to be cumbersome and potentially costly. Nevertheless, it should be borne in mind that similar reporting obligations are required under the Directive on Administrative Cooperation and at international level through the OECD Global Standard for Automatic Exchange of Information. Concerning the possible discrimination towards consumers and their right to payment accounts, all consumers who are legally resident in the EU, including real and accidental Americans, are entitled to open a basic payment account irrespective of their nationality or member state of residence under the Payment Accounts Directive. Should member states not enforce this directive, the Commission will decide on appropriate measures, including launching infringement procedure. Member states appear to have followed similar approaches to the issue. They have concluded bilateral agreements with the United States based on the same model. National legislation implementing the agreements has to be in line with the requirements of EU data protection law and the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. When national data protection authorities analysed the issue in February 2018, they found that there had been no occasions where the processing and transfer of data to the United States under FATCA had to be prohibited. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Jourova. Now for the EPP group, Peter Jahr, for 2 minutes.
Madam President, thank you very much. From the view of the Petitions Committee and having heard the Commissioner and trying to summarise all of this, I suppose you could say that in the stream of truths, you've got lies flowing in the stream as well. So we're talking about taxpayers, and obviously the states are trying to cover all their taxpayers around the world. The Petitions Committee, however, is dealing with a specific group of petitioners, of people who accidentally have become American citizens. And there is an example, for example, if a child is born, sometimes the child may have been born in the United States. The parents then go back to Europe with the baby, the child, but the child has automatically become an American citizen, has American citizenship, and when they come of age, they're adult. Well, yes, I suppose there's one advantage. They could potentially become an American president at some stage, but it has all sorts of other consequences as well. The bad news, of course, is when this person tries to open a bank account, you've said, well, generally speaking, this is possible, but the banks deal with it in the following way. They don't automatically say, no, you don't get a bank account. If they feel there's a risk, they'll take a look into this, send the person elsewhere. But if you're trying to take out a loan, they look at creditworthiness. So there is a risk as well when it comes to whether you have to pay taxes to the states or not. And the outcome is possibly that you wouldn't get a loan. One of the things that is a bit of a nuisance, well, obviously the Petitions Committee, we're talking about citizenship, European citizenship, and everybody has to stand together. We have a reference here from the Petitions Committee. In legal terms, perhaps they aren't competent for this, but maybe we ought to ask you to try and fight on this particular front to come up with a solution.
Thank you, Mr. Yar. Now for the S&D group, Virginie Rosière, for a minute and a half. Thank you, Madam President. We're debating this oral question this evening because the Petitions Committee in Parliament was approached by hundreds of EU citizens who are accidental Americans. This is a European citizen, contrary to what you might think, which the US consider that are associated with American citizenship by birth, ascendancy, or by mistake. These are dramatic consequences for these people. What they're asked to do is to come in line with American tax by paying 5 years in back tax. What does that mean? And that means at least 30,000 euros. It can be 80,000 or over 100,000 euros to pay. If you don't do that, you'll be refused elementary banking services. You might think these just a few cases. It's actually 100,000 people in the EU. It might be up to 500,000 people in the EU as a whole concerned. Why are we in this situation? Because the member states have applied FATCA and have assigned IGAs, which means extraterritorial application of EU legislation. The EU should defend its citizens so that they can attain their rights, and to have a European agreement which is reciprocal and which defends basic rights, and we should be against extraterritorial application of US law. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Rosière. For the ECR group now, Notis Marias, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. The Petitions Committee, my committee, receives hundreds of requests, and in this meeting and previous meetings we've raised issues which affect our citizens, and this issue is one that we've dealt with, the question of the Foreign Accounts Tax Compliance Act, FATCA. People who are obliged to pay taxes to a country which deems them its citizens. And a specific directive of the European Union, the fundamental rights of our citizens are being violated here. And the raising of tax is something which is up to individual member states. And each member state has got bilateral agreements with the United States on the question of FATCA. But I think we should approach the member states and ask them to take measures to sort out these issues. There was someone in France, for example, who got in touch with them and sorted the problem out. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Marias. For the ALDE group, Sophia Intveld for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I have to say I'm quite dismayed to hear the presidency say that that it's not your task to evaluate the impact on citizens. If the situation of citizens is not your concern, then what are you doing here? It is our prime concern. And you know what the funny thing is? There are only 2 countries in the world that have citizen-based taxation. The one is the US, the other is Eritrea. And when Eritrea came here to Europe and tried to impose taxes on Eritrean citizens here, everybody reacted. Apparently then it was our concern. So what's different now? So you think that international relations are more important than the interests of your own citizens? That's funny. And the other thing that's also funny, when I started to dig into this 6 years ago, I got the same answer, saying, oh, taxation, well, there's nothing we could do. Americans decide on their own system. We hardly have any talks with the Americans about this. And then I made a request for access to documents, and I got 14,000 documents, correspondence between the European Commission and the US authorities on FATCA. So why are you saying that it doesn't concern you? What you're saying is that your relationship with the American authorities you consider more important than the rights of citizens. And we're not just talking about basic bank accounts. We're talking about getting a mortgage loan to buy a house, which I think is a fundamental right, or a business loan for SME that we were just talking about. So if you can tell Eritrea off, surely you can tell the United States off. We're talking about at least 110,000 citizens in the European Union. That is 7 countries of the European Union, so we're probably talking hundreds of thousands. You've just started your presidency. Maybe it would be a good start, even before the summer break, to show a little more concern for the interest of European citizens. So I expect the European Council to start talks with the United States about the abolition of citizen-based taxation, or at the very least an exemption for EU citizens, because it is your duty.
Paljon kiitos.
Thank you very much. Eleonora Evi now for the EFDD group.
Thank you, Madam President. As the huge number of petitions received, 300 citizens, including several of these accidental Americans, are undergoing terrible personal problems directly linked to the extraterritorial tax legislation of the US, known as FATCA, and applied in the European Union through bilateral intergovernmental agreements countries entered into with the United States. There's a denial of essential banking services to some of these citizens, which of course is extremely serious and therefore needs to have very urgent remedial action in order to protect the fundamental rights of our citizens. We need an assessment, an overall assessment of the impact on our citizens of FATCA and the US extraterritorial actions as far as its citizens-based taxation system. I think it's a pity that in the 6th of July 2016 resolution, this House had already noted that the US has not been reciprocal with the EU under FATCA. This also needs, I think, to be tackled and sorted out. we need to make certain there is at least full reciprocity as far as information to be exchanged is concerned. Obviously, we're talking about money laundering and tax avoidance, and we need to have total transparency in this area. But I add my voice to that of colleagues who have said that this can't be sorted out just by the Commission. The Council needs to take it seriously and show greater commitment on this problem, which needs to be sorted out urgently. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Ms. Evi. Now, individual speakers. First of all, Alex Meyer. 1 minute.
Thank you. Panicked, isolated and scared. That's how 73-year-old Cambridge pensioner Merrin Grimley says she felt when she got a threatening letter telling her she needed to pay US tax. Born to British parents, having gone to school in Britain, worked all her life in Britain and retired in Britain, she's now being chased down like a criminal by the United States. She didn't even know that she was accidentally an American citizen because she was born there. I believe that we need to act. FATCA breaches the right to data privacy of the European Convention on Human Rights, and the big financial barriers to renouncing citizenship breach Article 15 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's costing Merrin over $2,300 to get rid of the US citizenship she never wanted nor knew that she had. I urge the Commission to act, and I will also be asking Theresa May to raise this subject with Donald Trump on his forthcoming visits to Britain. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mayer. Now, Helga Stevens for 1 minute.
Voorzitter, collega's, de meeste landen heffen enkel...
Madam President and dear colleagues, we've seen that the United States impose taxes on their territory, but also on their own citizens who live outside the United States. And this means that the United States citizens have to file a tax return every year. And some European citizens have also received a request to file such a tax return because they were born in the United States. And given the exchange of information, this obviously goes ahead, and they have to provide this information under the Payments Accounts Directive. I have received a request, a petition, and I tried to get some information from the Finance Minister, and I would demand that right now the European institutions that do safeguard the interests of our citizens.
Thank you, Ms. Stevens. Bernard Monod, now 1 minute. He isn't here. So the last request for the floor is Pervenche Beres. Ms. Beres, you have the floor.
I do apologise, Madam President. Thanks very much. Thanks to Council and Commission for what they've said, but listening to you, I can't help thinking that you kind of met any of these accidental Americans. These Americans, in spite of themselves, they're European citizens who find themselves in an extremely odd situation because they are confronted with a country, the United States, that set up its own nationality system which is unique, so you can't talk about reciprocity. It's a problem because of the way that the US nationality is awarded, so you need to bear that in mind. You've also got a problem linked to the way in which the US has declared extraterritoriality here, which has an impact as well. Commissioner, please try to meet some of these accidental Americans. They're people who are European citizens, basically, but they are discriminated against. The logic of FATCA application, as far as they're concerned, mean that they are abandoned to their fate because the bank doesn't have to bother in terms of applying FATCA. You've said that it's up to member states to negotiate an agreement or some tax accord. Fair enough, But when our banks are basically bowing to the whims of FATCA, if they want to continue to benefit from access to the American market and don't want to have 30% levied on their income, then it really becomes something you need to negotiate financial market to financial market. That's why I'd ask you and Vice President Dombrovskis, every time you go to the United States, to raise this matter. The principle of proportionality is very important.
Thank you, Ms. Beres. Now, we have 2 requests under Catch the Eye, but only one of those is here, and that's Sean Kelly. 1 minute.
The 3 leading speakers here this evening on behalf of institutions were 3 ladies, and they gave us a very good overview of this problem with FATCA. Also compliments to the Petitions Committee, who do such wonderful work, for highlighting this issue. My first reaction was, if the shoe was on the other foot and it was European countries demanding tax from accidental Europeans in the United States, Trump would be up all night tweeting about it and threatening fire and brimstone upon us. So we need to look at it from that point of view and take action. Secondly, I think what my colleague here, Wilkström, said, an impact assessment needs to be done to establish the extent of this and to find out what actually is happening in the greatest detail. Also, you mentioned the GDPR, which has come in May last month. Is this in breach of it? Then if it is, it has to stop, because I think we have to ensure that our citizens are protected from FATCA being applied by the fat cats of the American revenue commissioners.
Thank you. Now I'd ask Commissioner Jourova to take the floor.
Madam President, honourable members, I would like to thank you again for raising this issue and making us aware of the difficulties faced by accidental Americans. Let me reiterate that the Commission was not part in the negotiations with the United States of the rules implementing FATCA in the Member States, which remain a Member State competence. But I promise I will speak to my fellow Commissioner Moscovici about a possible concerted way forward with the Member States to approach US tax authorities. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Jourova. Finally, for the Council, Karolina Edstadler.
Dear President, honourable members, ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for giving me the floor. I have followed this discussion with interest. I have heard also the input from the Commission and from the MEPs who stayed late this evening to fight for the people affected, and I fully appreciate this. I understand some Member States have been in contact bilaterally with the US authorities over concerns linked to the implementation of FATCA. Against the background and regarding the question which was raised, and I would more of this say the accusation raised by MEP Feld by several times, why the EU is not more actively and stands together in that question pursuing the issue, I would like to state that the EU was not called by now upon to take collective action, since Member States have been dealing with this issue individually in close cooperation with the US. And in your direction, MEP Feld, I saw you changed your place. I thought you were leaving already, so I'm happy that you are still here. I would prefer to be quoted correctly, because it is not the role, I said, it is not the role of the Council to evaluate the impact of an intergovernmental agreement concluded by Member States and the US. That's not the role of the Council, and I would state that again, because there are bilateral agreements of which we are talking here. Nevertheless, the Payment Account Directive contains a detailed review clause. The Commission has been requested both by the Council and by the European Parliament to submit the report 3 years after implementation of the directive, accompanied by any appropriate proposals. The report will deal in particular with infringements to the application of the directive. The report should also highlight the number of credit institutions offering payment accounts with basic features, the associate fees, the characteristics of the consumers who have opened payment accounts with basic features, as well as best practices for reducing consumers' exclusion from access to payment services. However, the presidency will remain, of course, available for exchanges on the subject as needed and is ready to be in touch with the Commission. So I hope that I was able to clarify the situation, and I thank you again for your attention.
Thank you. Ms. Edstadler. The debate is now concluded, and at the conclusion of the debate, I have received one motion for a resolution from the Petitions Committee. The vote will be tomorrow. The next sitting will be tomorrow, Thursday, 5th of July, from 9 to 2 and from 3 to 4. The agenda has been published and it is available. The sitting is concluded, and I wish everybody a very good night.